Commandant Vireth Kalasa had reviewed 41 intake cohorts in his career, and he had long ago stopped expecting any of them to surprise him. This was not cynicism. It was simply the accumulated weight of evidence. The Threshold Spire Academy had stood on the northern shelf of Corvain Prime for 190 cycles, and in that time, it had processed cadets from every major species in the coalition of bound stars, and a good number of the minor ones as well. The building had seen everything. Vireth had seen most of it twice. He sat now in his office on the third tier of the administrative wing, a room with one wall of reinforced glass that looked out over the training yards, currently empty under the gray wash of the perimeter lighting. It was late. The rest of the academy had gone quiet hours ago, the particular quiet of a first night. Cadets sealed into new quarters, uncertain of their neighbors, too keyed up to sleep and too exhausted to do anything about it. He liked this quiet. It was the only time the building felt like it belonged to him rather than to the endless churn of bodies moving through it. 42 files sat in front of him, arranged in the order the intake terminal had assigned them, alphabetical by species designation, which meant no meaningful order at all, just an administrative accident that happened to put things in a sequence. He worked through them methodically the way he always did. Assessment data first, photograph second, biographical notes last. He had learned early in his tenure that reading the story of a person before reading their numbers colored the numbers. The numbers deserved to be read clean. A Corvain cadet, his own species, with a wingspan 2% below cohort average and a resting metabolic rate that suggested either a nervous disposition or an unusually efficient one. He would find out which within the first month. He made a note and moved on. A pair of Thesk. Their carapace density readings clustered tightly together in the way Thesk always clustered. Since they were raised in creches and shared enough genetic stock that variance was rare. Unremarkable. He flagged nothing. An Ilvani whose neural response times were, as always with the Ilvani, faster than the equipment's ability to measure them with confidence. The scanner had appended its usual disclaimer about margin of error at the upper bound. Vireth had seen this disclaimer on every Ilvani file he had ever reviewed, and no longer read it as anything other than a formality. Then, near the bottom of the stack, out of alphabetical coincidence rather than design, human. He opened the file the way he opened all of them. Cadet designation Marcus Aldous Webb. Species human Terran. Intake class first generation diplomatic. Height, within the low-middle range of recorded human variants. Mass, unremarkable. Reach index, 2 points below cohort mean, which for a human was itself already below the cohort mean of every other species in the room. Humans being on average shorter and lighter-limbed than most of the coalition's combat-capable member species. Muscle density, within standard parameters. Grip strength, unremarkable. Vireth had reviewed 7 human cadets in his career, spread across 3 prior cohorts ever since the Terran Compact had been granted a limited enrollment quota as part of the broader diplomatic normalization process. He had, if he was honest with himself, developed something like a template for what a human file looked like. Numbers clustered in the lower middle of whatever range they were measured against, compensated for, according to the delegation's own liaison officers, by unusually stubborn endurance and an almost pathological unwillingness to recognize when a contest was over. He had come to think of this as a species-level personality trait rather than a physical one, since nothing in the raw data supported the endurance claims beyond what any well-conditioned cadet from any species could produce. He scrolled to the skeletal density reading. The scanner had flagged it. Probable calibration artifact. Reading exceeds all previously recorded coalition species parameters by a margin inconsistent with biological plausibility. Normalized per Section 6 averaging protocol. Normalized value within standard human range. Vireth looked at the raw figure sitting above the flag, then at the flag itself, then at the normalized figure the system had substituted for it. This was not new. He had seen this exact flag on 2 of the previous 7 human files. The scanner, encountering a reading that fell far outside every known biological baseline in its reference library, did the only sensible thing a well-designed instrument could do. It assumed its own error rather than assuming a new category of the possible, and it corrected the number down into a range that made sense. This was, in fact, exactly what he would have wanted the instrument to do. A scanner that treated every anomaly as a genuine discovery would be useless, buried under false positives, unable to distinguish a real signal from noise. The averaging protocol existed precisely so that competent instruments did not waste command staff's time chasing sensor glitches. He accepted the correction and moved to the photograph. A face that would need a second look to place in a crowd, and a third look to remember afterward. The particular unremarkableness of a species that had only been part of the wider galactic community for a handful of decades, still building up the visual vocabulary that let other species tell one human apart from another. At a glance, the biographical notes were brief. Webb had been selected for the diplomatic quota through a merit process on the Terran side that Vereth privately suspected was as much about political optics as martial aptitude. A photogenic representative of the reasonable cooperative wing of a species whose reputation among the coalition's older members ranged from cautiously optimistic to frankly nervous, depending on who you asked and how many border skirmishes they'd personally been involved in during the early contact years. He wrote the single notation the file required: diplomatic admission, Terran compact, standard monitoring protocol. Then he closed it, set it on top of the completed stack, and allowed himself one more look out at the empty yard before he went home. 42 cadets sealed in their quarters, beginning the first night of whatever they were going to become. The academy did not care which of them turned out to matter. It had outlasted every cohort that had ever passed through it, and it would outlast this one too. He believed that, on this particular night, with the same untroubled certainty he had believed it on the previous 40, the cohort settled the way cohorts always settled, awkwardly at first, cliques forming along the lines of shared language or shared physiology, then slowly loosening as the shared misery of the assessment schedule did what it always did, which was to manufacture a kind of camaraderie out of people who otherwise had nothing in common except being tired at the same time of day. Webb settled into the middle of this process without distinguishing himself in either direction. He was neither the cadet other species avoided, nor the one they gravitated toward. He ate his meals at the same table as two of the Thesk, and occasionally, the nervous Corvain cadet from Vereth's own species review. He was, by every account that reached the commandant's desk over the following weeks, competent, quiet, and thoroughly unremarkable, a description that Vereth reflected could have been copied word for word from the files of the 6 human cadets who had come before him. The Academy's senior combat instructor was a Corvain named Doran Ash, 31 years into a career that had made him, by consensus of everyone who had ever passed through his sparring hall, the finest hand-to-hand instructor the Spire had ever employed. Ash ran the assessment floor the way he had always run it, standing at the edge rather than the center, letting cadets read the room for themselves instead of telling them what to see. Vereth had watched him work for 3 decades and had never once seen him alter that habit for the benefit of an observer, which was one of several reasons he considered Ash irreplaceable. 6 weeks into the cycle, Vereth took his customary seat in the gallery above the assessment floor, unannounced, at no fixed time, the way he always did. The cadets knew the visits happened. They did not know when. That unpredictability was, in Vereth's judgment, the entire pedagogical point. You could not teach a cadet to perform correctly only when observed, if they never knew when observation was occurring. He watched the pairings roll through their preliminary bouts with the same attentive patience he brought to every gallery session. A Corvain against a Thesk, producing a bout that was educational for both parties and mildly bruising for one of them. 2 Ilvani circling each other with the hyper-alert stillness that made Ilvani bout simultaneously the fastest and, paradoxically, the most static-looking matches on the floor, since so much of the actual fighting happened in reaction windows too brief for most other species to perceive without slowed footage. Then Webb. His opponent was a Thesk cadet Vereth recognized from the intake review, unremarkable in that file as well. Carapace density, mid-range, nothing flagged. 2 unremarkable cadets, paired to provide the floor with a bout rather than a lesson, which was itself a legitimate function of the assessment schedule. Not every match needed to teach anyone anything. Some matches simply needed to happen so that the schedule could move forward. The bout opened standard, Both cadets read each other with the careful attentiveness of a first real assessment, each testing the other's guard with probing strikes that carried more information than force. Webb moved with an economy that Vireth noted and filed without particular interest. Competent footwork, the kind that did its job without drawing attention to itself, exactly what the intake data had predicted. The Thesk found an opening on Webb's forearm. Clean strike, reasonable force, the kind of contact that in any cadet with a standard density index should have produced at minimum a flinch, a fractional pullback, some visible acknowledgement that something had happened. Webb absorbed it without any of that. Not stoically, there was no visible effort in it, no gritted teeth performance of toughness. He absorbed it the way a support beam absorbed a knock, registering the fact of the contact, processing it, declining to rearrange itself in response. The Thesk shook out their forelimb. A small motion, brief, the kind of automatic gesture a body made when it had struck something and wanted to be reminded that the limb still worked correctly. Not an injury, a note to self. Vireth watched this from the gallery and ran the instinctive check every experienced observer ran without quite meaning to. Mass, reach, expected impact absorption. The numbers came back exactly where they should. The scanner's normalized reading held. He looked for an explanation and found one without difficulty. Assessment day adrenaline could account for a degree of anomalous impact tolerance, particularly in a cadet whose species was documented, if anecdotally, for a stubborn refusal to acknowledge pain during structured contests. He filed the observation as noted, not concerning, and returned his attention to the floor. The bout ended a few exchanges later, unremarkably, with a scoring strike that Ash called clean. Vireth watched 3 more pairings with the same even attention, confirmed nothing further worth flagging, and went home for the evening without giving Webb's file a second thought. He would, in the weeks that followed, wonder at his own confidence in that moment. Not with guilt, exactly, since there had been nothing careless in the observation, but with the particular unease of a man realizing that competence and correctness were not always the same thing. A short word from our sponsor. If you're enjoying today's story, this channel is proud to be supported by listeners just like you. Every bit of support helps us commission more scripts, bring on more voice talent, and keep these stories coming. Now, back to the story. 10 weeks into the cycle, the cohort reached the milestone every Threshold Spire class reached at roughly this point in their first term, the Instructor demonstration. It was, by tradition older than Vireth's own tenure as Commandant, a deliberately theatrical exercise. Ash would select a cadet, typically the one whose assessments to that point had drawn the least attention, the least flagged, the most thoroughly unremarkable, and spar them himself in front of the assembled cohort. Not to humiliate them, but to teach the room something that couldn't be taught any other way, that even the least dangerous-seeming opponent deserved a fighter's full attention, and that even the most decorated instructor in the building could still be surprised by a body he hadn't personally trained. It was, Vireth had always privately believed, less a lesson about the selected cadet than a lesson about the folly of assumption. Ash had run this exercise dozens of times over his career, and Vireth had watched most of them from this same gallery rail. The outcome was reliably the same. The selected cadet lasted a respectable but brief interval. Ash demonstrated some combination of superior technique and physical advantage, with complete control and zero unnecessary force, and the cohort walked away with a clean, bloodless lesson in humility. He had no reason to expect this instance to differ. Ash stepped onto the floor mid-session, breaking from the standard pairing rotation without ceremony. The cohort felt the shift immediately. A ripple of stillness moving through 42 bodies as they registered that something had changed in the room's structure. Ash did not explain himself. He looked directly at Webb. "Cadet," he said. One word. Webb stepped forward. Vireth watched this unfold with the settled satisfaction of a man watching a familiar ritual proceed exactly as expected. The pedagogy was clean. The cohort's least flagged cadet against its most decorated instructor. Not cruelty, the opposite of cruelty, in fact, since the entire point was to demonstrate that the instructor's respect for an opponent did not depend on how threatening that opponent looked on paper. Webb settled into a ready stance, weight back, guard raised, present without either nervousness or performance. He watched Ash with the attentiveness of someone who understood a lesson was about to occur and had not yet determined what it would be. Ash read him the way Vireth had watched him read hundreds of cadets before. The calculation visible in the small adjustments of his stance, weight distribution, shoulder loading, the accumulated instinct of 3 decades translating a body's surface presentation into a prediction about what that body could withstand. Everything about Webb's presentation was consistent with everything the intake data had said. Unremarkable mass. Unremarkable reach. Nothing in the visible geometry of him suggested anything other than what the file had recorded. The exchange opened with probing strikes on both sides. Ash reading Webb's footwork, finding the rhythm of his weight transfer, locating with practiced precision exactly where a strike would need to land to produce the intended lesson. Decisive, controlled, educational, and above all, safe. Vireth had watched Ash throw this exact demonstration kick dozens of times across dozens of cohorts. He knew, 3 full beats before it launched, precisely what was coming and precisely what it would do to a target with Webb's index density. Ash loaded the strike, full hip rotation, complete weight commitment, a lateral kick aimed cleanly at the outer thigh, the kind of strike calibrated over decades to deliver an unmistakable, controlled lesson without doing any lasting harm to a cadet whose bones and tissue fell within any known biological range the instructor had ever trained against. The kick landed exactly where it was aimed. What happened to Ash's leg in the following half-second was not gradual. There was no visible sequence of smaller failures Vireth could have caught if he had been watching more closely. He had been watching as closely as it was possible to watch. The kick connected. The leg received the impact. And the leg's response to that impact was not the response it had given, reliably, in every assessment for 31 years. The sound arrived after the visual, as sound always did across the 30 feet between the floor and the gallery rail. But this sound was wrong in a way Vireth had never before encountered from this position. He had heard bones break in training halls and in the field, at close range and at distance, and in his experience the sound was always smaller than the moment prepared you for, a crack, quick and almost disappointing in its lack of drama. This was not that sound. This arrived with mass to it, the particular finality of a structure that had been asked a question its engineering had no answer for. Ash did not fall gracefully. He did not catch himself. This told Vireth, even in the first frozen half-second of processing what he had just witnessed, something important about the totality of the failure. A man with 31 years of trained reflex should have been physically incapable of not catching himself, and the fact that he hadn't meant the failure had removed that option before his body had a chance to attempt it. The cadets nearest him stepped back, not from fear but from reflex, the animal recoil of bodies too close to a sudden violent event. 2 others were already moving toward him before he'd fully reached the floor. The medical team came off the wall at a dead run. The hall filled with something that was not shock silence. Vireth had sat in rooms silenced by shock before, and those rooms carried a charge, a held breath waiting for someone to release it. This was different. 42 cadets were performing, simultaneously and at varying speeds, a rapid, unwilled recalculation. Something had happened that did not fit inside the category they'd filed it under, and each of them was, in their own way, trying to locate the correct one. Vireth ran the calculation himself from the gallery with the mechanical thoroughness of long habit. Angle, correct. Force, standard, well within the safe range for the index target. Contact point, confirmed outer thigh, exactly as intended. Technique, without error, from load to contact, no deviation in any variable he had personally tracked. He ran it again. Same answer. He ran it a 3rd time. The calculation was consistent, which meant one of 3 things was true. The calculation itself was wrong, or the variables feeding it were wrong, or his understanding of what those variables actually described was wrong. He did not yet know which, and the not knowing sat in his chest without an immediate category to file itself under, a sensation he had not experienced, in this specific form, in the entirety of his tenure. He looked at Webb. Webb had lowered his guard the moment the match was clearly, unambiguously over, responding to that fact with the unhurried practicality of someone who did not need to be told twice. He was looking down, not at Ash, not at the cadets rushing to help, not up at the gallery, at his own leg with an expression Vireth studied from 30 feet up and could not immediately classify. It was not triumph. Nothing in it read as satisfaction, or the suppressed shadow of satisfaction a cadet might try to hide under observation. It was not surprise either. Not the expression of someone confronted with an outcome entirely outside what they'd expected from the world. It sat somewhere in between, the look of an engineer discovering that a support structure had held under load conditions it had never been formally rated for. Mild, professional, faintly, quietly relieved. Near the front of the floor, one of the Thesk cadets said something in their own dialect. Low, involuntary. Vireth didn't speak Thesk, but he recognized the register without needing the words, the tone of someone who had just witnessed something they would be describing in detail for the rest of their life. Vireth was already moving toward the stairs. He took the stairs at a pace that was not quite urgent and held that same pace down the corridor to the medical station, arriving to find Ash already speaking with the medics, not being spoken to, speaking, dictating rather than receiving, in the clipped cadence of a man managing his own treatment through sheer force of professional habit. The prognosis, once the senior medic finished the scan, was roughly what Vireth had expected once he'd absorbed the nature of the break. Clean fracture would knit correctly given proper setting and time. 12 to 16 weeks off the floor depending on healing and physiotherapy progress. The medic added without particular ceremony that the leg would likely announce the arrival of weather changes for the rest of Ash's career. Ash received this information with the same flat professional acceptance he gave the recovery timeline, the expression of a man who found the situation professionally unacceptable and personally irrelevant, since his opinion of it changed nothing about what it was. Vireth processed the prognosis, filed it, and found himself sometime later, standing alone in the empty sparring hall. He had not consciously decided to go there. He had simply arrived. The hall carried the particular feeling of a room that had recently held something significant and had since been emptied of it. The floor was clean. The lighting was unchanged. Nothing in the room's physical state indicated anything unusual had occurred there, which was, he supposed, the correct condition for an assessment floor to be in. He found it strange anyway, standing at the spot where Webb had been positioned when the kick landed, aware that he was searching the floor for something it had no way of showing him, and equally aware that the awareness did nothing to stop him from looking. He returned to his office and pulled Webb's intake file. The data sat exactly where he had left it 10 weeks earlier, because intake data did not revise itself to accommodate subsequent events, however dramatic those events turned out to be. Skeletal density index, still flagged. Probable calibration artifact. Reading exceeds all previously recorded coalition species parameters, normalized per Section 6 protocol. Below it, the normalized figure the system had substituted in its place, the number that had told him, with complete instrumental confidence, that there was nothing here worth a second look. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he pulled the scanner's complete calibration log for intake day, a process that took longer than it should have, since the calibration records lived in a different database from the intake files themselves, a structural inefficiency he had noted years earlier and never gotten around to correcting. The scanner had been functioning correctly on intake day. Every other reading in the cohort cross-checked cleanly against known species baselines. The Corvain's wingspan measurement confirmed against a decade of prior Corvain intakes. The Thesk figures confirmed. The Ilvani's neural response margin confirmed, disclaimer and all. The instrument had not drifted. It had not malfunctioned. It had been working exactly as designed when it produced a reading that fell outside every biological parameter it had ever been asked to measure. He pulled the bout record from Webb's preliminary sparring match 6 weeks earlier, the one he'd personally observed from the gallery, and filed as unremarkable. The record was brief. Engagement notes, duration, outcome, assessment. At the bottom, under medical notations, minor contusion, forelimb, opposing cadet. Contact sustained during sparring assessment against Cadet Webb. No further action required. He read it once. He looked back at the skeletal density figure sitting in the open intake file. He read the medical note again. The 2 entries sat on his desk unmoving. and for a long moment he simply looked at them the way one looks at something that had been sitting in the room the entire time without being seen. The cadet's forelimb, shaken out after contact. Webb's forearm, absorbing a clean strike without redistribution. The same arithmetic, at a smaller scale, 6 weeks before the sparring hall produced a sound with mass to it. He had watched the earlier moment happen. He had filed it correctly according to every standard his training had given him for what a filed observation should look like. The data had been sitting in the record twice before Ash's leg made it something he could no longer set aside. He sat with this for considerably longer than a moment. It was not grief and it was not embarrassment. Those were responses calibrated for failures of effort or judgment, and this had not been that kind of failure. He had not been careless. He had not been lazy. He had read every data point correctly and processed each one through the best instrument available to him, which was a rubric he had spent 28 cycles refining, and the rubric had given him precisely the answer it had been built to give. The wall he had spent his career leaning against had, without any dramatic collapse, quietly shifted 3 inches to the left. Not a crisis. A recalibration, quiet, total, and entirely about the distance between where he had believed the wall to be standing and where it had in fact been standing all along. He opened the intake assessment rubric and navigated to the section governing skeletal density protocol. He found the averaging clause he had personally written 28 cycles earlier, back when the rubric was new enough that he could still remember the reasoning behind every provision in it. He read it now with the particular attention of a man rereading his own writing in search of an assumption he had never once thought to examine. He found it in the second sentence. No species in coalition intake history has produced a skeletal density, reading sufficiently divergent from its surface presentation, to require a separate assessment category. Anomalous readings exceeding acceptable deviation from species-adjusted expected range are therefore attributed to calibration variance and normalized accordingly. Therefore, he had written it as though the second sentence followed inevitably from the first, the way a conclusion follows from evidence. And it did follow, provided the premise held. The premise had held, without a single documented exception, for 28 cycles. And the unbroken correctness of the results had made the premise itself invisible, because a person did not generally interrogate the foundation of something that had never once failed them. If it had been failing, surely the results would have said so. The results had said so. Twice in Webb's file alone before the sparring hall had forced the truth into a category impossible to ignore. The eye and the data had agreed with each other, the way they always agreed. The eye recording an unremarkable cadet, the data recording an impossible number, and the rubric resolving the disagreement in the eye's favor because the eye had never once been wrong before. Neither instrument had actually been in error. Neither had contained a category for the gap between what a human's outward presentation suggested and what a human skeleton could apparently withstand. Virith had built that gap into his own rubric and called it quality control, and for 28 cycles it had functioned without his knowledge as a blindfold. He deleted the averaging clause. In its place he wrote 3 sentences, plain and administrative without drama. Anomalous skeletal density readings would henceforth be flagged, preserved unmodified, and cross-referenced against species point-of-origin data before any normalization was applied. The flag itself was not to be treated as an error to be corrected. The flag was the finding. He read the new language once, carefully, filed the amendment, and closed the file. The incident did not stay contained to a single sparring hall for very long. Ash's injury was, by Academy policy, a reportable event, which meant it crossed Virith's desk in triplicate over the following days. First as a medical incident report, then as a training safety review, then finally as a formal inquiry from the Coalition's Joint Academies Oversight Council, an institution that rarely involved itself in the internal affairs of any single school, unless something had occurred that suggested a systemic issue rather than an isolated one. Virith submitted his amendment to the skeletal density protocol alongside the incident report, and included, at the Council's request, the complete data trail, the original scanner reading, the averaging clause that had suppressed it, the sparring bout 6 weeks prior that had shown the same pattern in miniature, and his own analysis of how a well-designed, well-intentioned instrument had produced a systematically wrong answer for 28 consecutive cycles without ever once appearing to malfunction. The response from the council took 3 weeks to arrive, and when it did, it was considerably larger than Vireth had anticipated. It turned out that Threshold Spire was not the only academy carrying an averaging clause of this kind. Nearly every major training institution in the Coalition used some variant of the same protocol, for the same entirely reasonable reason Vireth had originally written it, because no instrument could function usefully if it treated every anomaly as a genuine discovery rather than as noise. The protocol had never been wrong before because no species prior to the human intake quota had ever produced a genuine biological outlier extreme enough to trigger it in a way that turned out, upon investigation, to actually be true. A joint working group was convened, quietly, without public announcement, the way the Coalition preferred to handle findings that had the potential to unsettle a delicate diplomatic balance still less than 3 decades old. Human recruits from academies across a dozen worlds were quietly retested, using raw, unnormalized instrumentation. The results, when they were finally compiled and circulated to command staff with appropriate clearance, confirmed what Vireth's amended file had already suggested. Human skeletal density, tendon tensile strength, and connective tissue resilience sat, on average, dramatically above every other Coalition species baseline. Not in every measurable category, and not by a margin that made humans faster or stronger in any way that showed up in ordinary assessment metrics, but specifically in the ability to absorb sudden structural load without catastrophic failure. The explanation, when the Terran Compact's own liaison scientists were consulted, turned out to be almost embarrassingly straightforward, the kind of answer that felt obvious only once it had been said aloud. Humans had evolved on a world with significantly higher gravity than the median Coalition homeworld, in an evolutionary lineage shaped by several million years of falling, out of trees, off cliffs, down slopes, into each other, in a species whose survival had depended, again and again, on skeletal and connective architecture, capable of surviving impacts that would have ended a less structurally stubborn ancestor. It was not a trait humans had been selected for, because it was useful in combat. It was a trait that had simply never stopped being useful, long after the trees were gone, and had carried forward into a species whose surface presentation, soft-skinned, unarmored, lightly muscled by Coalition combat standards, gave almost no visual indication of what was actually holding it together underneath. Vireth read the full report twice. He found, to his mild surprise, that his primary reaction was not alarm. He had half expected alarm from himself, given how thoroughly his own instrument had failed him, and given the discomfort of realizing that a diplomatic admission he had privately filed as symbolic had, in fact, been carrying information the entire Academy's assessment infrastructure had been actively engineered, however unintentionally, to suppress. What he felt instead was something closer to the sensation of a wall stepping back into its correct position. 28 cycles of correct results built on an incomplete premise had produced not a false confidence exactly, but a narrower one than the evidence actually supported. A confidence shaped by the boundaries of what he had previously encountered, rather than by the actual boundaries of what was possible. The correction did not undo any of the 28 cycles of good work the rubric had done. It simply added a category the rubric had never needed before because nothing had ever required it before. Not every member of the working group accepted the findings without resistance, and Vireth found himself, in the weeks following the Council's initial circulation, fielding more correspondence than he had in the previous 3 cycles combined. The loudest objection came from a senior assessment officer at the Ilvani Homeworld's flagship academy, a scholar named Thren Ivask Koral, who had spent the better part of a long career refining the very averaging protocols now under coalition-wide review. Her objection, delivered first in a formal memorandum and later in a considerably less formal real-time channel, was not that Vireth's data was fabricated, she did not doubt the reading itself, but that a single confirmed outlier, however dramatic, did not justify dismantling a quality control system that had functioned correctly for every other species in recorded coalition history. You are proposing, she wrote in the clipped diplomatic phrasing the Ilvani favored even when irritated, that we redesign a protocol serving 11 species with a flawless track record because it failed once for one species, under conditions that may never recur. This is not correction. This is overcorrection driven by a single dramatic incident. Virith found the objection reasonable enough to take seriously, which was, he reflected, rather the point of the exercise. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he requested and received 6 additional weeks of raw, unnormalized data from every academy currently participating in the review, not to prove his case louder, but to determine whether it was actually true. The additional data, when it arrived, did not merely confirm the original finding, it sharpened it considerably. Of the 211 human cadets tested across 9 academies under the new unmodified protocol, 194 had produced skeletal density readings that would have triggered the old averaging clause. Not one had produced a reading that, upon confirmed physical testing, turned out to actually be a calibration error. The anomaly was not a single dramatic outlier. It was, in the plainest statistical sense available to him, simply what humans were. He forwarded the compiled results to Thren Corell with a note considerably shorter than her original memorandum. You were right to demand more evidence before accepting a correction of this scale. Here is more evidence. I believe it answers the objection. Her reply, when it came a week later, was equally brief and contained, buried in the formal Ilvani phrasing, something Virith recognized as an apology delivered in the only register a career instrument builder was comfortable using. She adopted the amended protocol at her own academy within the month, ahead of the council's formal timeline, and included in her adoption notice a line Virith privately found more satisfying than any commendation he received from the council itself. The instrument was never the problem, only its assumptions were. Correcting an assumption is not the same failure as building a bad instrument, and I would ask my colleagues across the coalition to remember the difference before they resist a finding out of professional pride rather than professional judgment. Virith kept that line as well, alongside the flagged reading pinned inside his rubric. Between the two of them, he had begun to think of them as a matched pair, the number that had been true all along, and the sentence that explained why so many careful, competent people had needed an accident to see it. Virith called Webb to his office 3 weeks after the incident. Once the formal reports had cleared and the working group's preliminary findings had been circulated to command staff. He had debated, more than once, whether the conversation needed to happen at all. A commandant did not typically summon individual cadets to discuss administrative rubric amendments. But he found in the end that he wanted to conduct it anyway, for reasons that were not strictly procedural. Webb arrived on time, stood at a correct and unremarkable attention, and waited. Sit, Virith said, and gestured at the chair across the desk. Webb sat. You're aware, Virith said, of the review currently underway regarding the intake assessment protocol. I've heard rumors, sir. They're accurate rumors. Virith turned the desk display toward him, showing the original flagged reading unmodified. This is your intake skeletal density figure, as recorded, before normalization. Webb looked at it for a moment. His expression did not change in any way Virith could identify as significant. That's higher than I'd have guessed, sir. It's higher than anyone would have guessed. That was, in essence, the problem. Virith turned the display back. I want to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer rather than a diplomatically calibrated one. When Instructor Ash's strike landed during the demonstration, did you know what was going to happen? Webb considered the question with what appeared to be genuine care, rather than the reflexive caution of someone managing a superior's expectations. No, sir. Not specifically. I knew I could take a hit better than most people expected me to. I'd figured that out a long time before I ever got here. The ordinary way. The way anyone figures out what their body can do. Getting hurt less than you're supposed to, growing up. Falling off things and getting up. But I didn't know it would do that to someone else's leg. I don't think anybody could have predicted that specific outcome, sir, including me. And your reaction afterward, on the floor. Several cadets and one commandant found it difficult to read. A brief pause. Relief mostly, sir. That it wasn't worse for him, and... Webb hesitated, in a way that read as genuine rather than performed. Some part of it was just satisfaction, honestly. Not that he got hurt, that the thing I'd always sort of known about myself, that nobody here ever quite believed, turned out to be real in a way that couldn't be argued with anymore. That's not something I'm proud to admit, sir, but you asked for honest. Virith considered this for a moment. I appreciate the honesty. For what it's worth, Instructor Ash has expressed no resentment. He has, in fact, requested to be present for your future assessments once he's cleared to return to the floor. He described the injury as, and I quote, the most educational thing that's happened to me in 15 years, which from him is very close to a compliment. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Webb's face before he suppressed it, out of what Virith judged to be habit, rather than any real effort to hide it. That sounds like him, sir, from what I've seen. The protocol amendment will affect every human cadet who enters this academy going forward, and likely every academy in the coalition within the next several cycles, once the working group's findings are formally adopted. You should understand that you are, in a fairly literal sense, the reason for that change. Not because of anything you did deliberately, because a system built to catch errors encountered something that was not an error, and it took an accident to make that distinction visible. I understand, sir. I don't say that to burden you with it. I say it because I think it's worth knowing plainly, rather than leaving it as something everyone in this building quietly understands and no one states out loud. You didn't do anything wrong by being what you are. The instrument was wrong to assume what you couldn't be. Those are different failures, and only one of them was yours to correct, which you didn't need to, because it was never actually yours. Webb was quiet for a moment. Thank you, sir. I don't think anyone's put it that clearly before. Dismissed, Cadet. And Webb, Virith added as Webb rose. Try not to break anyone else's leg before graduation. One correction to institutional protocol per cohort is, I think, sufficient. I'll do my best, sir. Ash returned to the floor 14 weeks later, walking with a barely perceptible favor to the leg that the senior medic had promised would fade further with time and never fully disappear. He resumed his instructor duties with no apparent change in temperament, disposition, or willingness to demonstrate technique on any cadet the lesson required, including, on several later occasions, Webb himself, though always, Virith noted with some private amusement, at reduced force and always followed by a longer post-bout conversation than Ash typically bothered with for anyone else. The coalition-wide protocol review took the better part of a year to fully implement, moving through the particular glacial pace of any institution large enough to have 12 academies and 100 competing administrative interests. But it did eventually move. Every major training institution in the coalition adopted some version of Virith's amended flagging language. Human cadets in every subsequent intake cohort, across every academy that admitted them, had their skeletal and connective tissue data preserved unmodified from the outset, cross-referenced against a rapidly growing body of confirmed baseline data, rather than averaged down into a range built for species that had never needed the correction. The Terran Compact's diplomatic office, for its part, treated the whole affair with the particular restraint of a delegation that understood the value of not gloating in front of nervous allies. There was no formal statement, no press release, no diplomatic point scoring. There was, Virith heard secondhand, a good deal of quiet amusement within the Compact's own military liaison corps, several of whom had apparently spent years privately aware of exactly this fact about their own species and had simply never found an occasion where anyone outside the Compact had asked the right question in the right way to surface it. Webb graduated 18 months later, in the upper third of his cohort by every metric that mattered, and dead last, as always, in raw reach index. A number that Virith had come to understand told you considerably less about a person than it once appeared to. He went on, per the last update in his service record that crossed Virith's desk, to a training billet with the Compact's own Joint Forces Liaison Unit, tasked in part with helping design the very assessment protocols that other species would eventually use to understand what humans could actually do, rather than what their surface presentation suggested they could do. Virith attended the graduation ceremony himself, which was not, strictly speaking, a requirement of his post. Commandants were expected to preside over the formal proceedings, the reading of names, the presentation of insignia, but the informal gathering afterward, cadets and instructors mingling on the lower terrace with whatever refreshments the academy's kitchens had managed to produce for the occasion, was traditionally left to junior staff to supervise while the commandant retired to less crowded company. Vereth went anyway, and found Webb near the terrace rail, speaking with two of the Thesk cadets who had shared his intake cohort from the first night onward. "Commandant," Webb said, straightening slightly out of habit rather than any real formality the occasion required. "At ease, graduate. You've earned the right to stop doing that, at least for this evening." Vereth inclined his head toward the two Thesk. "I trust the last 18 months have been educational for all three of you, in ways that extend somewhat beyond the official curriculum." One of the Thesk, the same cadet Vereth realized whose forearm had absorbed that first unremarkable contact in the sparring hall 2 years earlier, the contact that had sat quietly unexamined in a medical file until it stopped being possible to ignore, made a gesture that Vereth had learned over 4 decades of working alongside Theska colleagues, translated roughly to wry acknowledgement. "I still tell people about it, Commandant. The bout. Nobody believes me until I show them the file." "You may tell them," Vereth said, "that the file is now considerably longer than it was and considerably more interesting reading than it used to be." He looked back to Webb. "Instructor Ash asked me to pass along a message, since he could not attend this evening personally. He said, and I am quoting him with reasonable confidence in my memory, that he expects to see you representing the Compact's liaison training programs within the decade, and that when that day comes, he intends to remind everyone in the room that he was the first to discover, at some personal cost, exactly what you were capable of." Something that was no longer a suppressed, almost smile crossed Webb's face this time. He let it happen fully, the particular unguarded expression of a young officer who had spent 2 years learning, among other things, that there was no longer any professional reason to hide it. "Please tell him I said thank you, Commandant, for the leg and for everything after it. I'll pass that along precisely as phrased. I imagine he'll find it appropriately absurd." Vereth allowed himself a rare moment of informality, resting one hand briefly on the terrace rail beside the small gathering, rather than standing at the measured distance his rank usually implied. "For what it's worth, graduate, and I say this to very few cadets, so take it for what it's worth, this academy is better calibrated than it was before you arrived in it. Not because of anything dramatic you set out to do, because an old assumption finally met evidence it couldn't be argued past, and the whole institution is more honest for it. That's not a small thing to have been part of, even accidentally. I'll try to remember that the next time someone asks why my reach index is still last in every cohort I'm compared against, sir." "Tell them," Vereth said, already turning to continue his circuit of the terrace, "that the index was never measuring the thing that mattered." Vereth kept a copy of the original flagged reading, 4.7, unmodified, the number that had sat quietly correct in a file for 6 weeks before anyone in the building had the framework to believe it, pinned to the inside cover of his own reference copy of the assessment rubric, where it remained for the rest of his tenure as commandant. Not as a trophy. As a reminder, plain and administrative, of the particular kind of error that came not from carelessness or bad instruments, but from a category the instrument had simply never needed before, and of how easily a person could mistake the absence of a category for the absence of a truth. The academy itself continued exactly as it always had. Cohorts arriving, cohorts departing, the stone of the training yards catching the same blue-white wash of perimeter light it had caught for 190 cycles before Vereth had ever taken the post, and would go on catching for as long as the institution stood. It had absorbed 40 generations of cadets, and emerged from every one of them with no particular visible opinion of any of them. But it had, in one small and permanent way, changed anyway. A single amended clause, sitting quietly in a rubric that every future commandant would inherit, waiting for the next reading that didn't fit, so that the next time, the number would be believed a little sooner. Vereth stood at the gallery rail one final time before his retirement, watching a cohort he would not see graduate run through its own preliminary bouts. The floor below him lit the same flat, shadowless white it had always been lit. Decoration withheld from a room whose only purpose had never required any. Somewhere in that cohort, he knew without needing to check the file, there would be at least one more flagged reading. A number that didn't fit, sitting quietly in a record, waiting to be either believed or explained away. He found, watching the new intake move through their unremarkable warm-up drills, that he no longer felt the old certainty that the anomaly, whenever it appeared, would resolve itself into something ordinary. Some walls, once you found them, stayed found. He allowed himself one more look at the empty stone beyond the glass, and then he went home. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed The Weight of a Number, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so you never miss the next one. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Let us know in the comments what you'd want to see in a future episode. Until next time, thank you for spending this time with us. Take care of each other out there.